Star Wars 7x7, episode 1855. Today, one of the biggest pressing questions of the Rise of Skywalker. Is it possible that Rey and Ben Solo will end up romantically linked by the end of the movie? What do you think, 3PO? Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode, and I've been thinking about Mike Climo recently. He's the guy who authored the Star Wars ring theory essay about how George Lucas was after some really amazing thing that nobody necessarily even realized and that he wasn't even talking about in terms of how he built the prequel trilogy to be a mirror of the original trilogy in its way. It's a remarkable essay, and there have also been things out there that have said, this is nonsense, and, take it for what you will. I think it's absolutely astounding, and it's a remarkable piece of work. But I've been thinking about him because the sequel trilogy is coming to an end, and I've been wondering how the sequel trilogy would end up playing into his idea of the ring theory, especially considering the fact that Lucas is not doing the sequel trilogy and the ideas that he had for the sequel trilogy were essentially set aside, even though elements of them were integrated and just integrated into different points in what was actually realized in the two movies that we have so far. I've been very curious to hear his opinion about how the sequel movies fit into this whole thing, if they do at all. But be that as it may, where it particularly pertains to today's episode is the question of Rey and Ben Solo, aka Kylo Ren, and whether they will end up together in some fashion at the end of the Rise of Skywalker. Now, when we last saw Rey and Ben, they had each thought that the other was going to switch to their side, and boy, that did not go how either of them thought it would. Luke called that one. And ultimately, they separated violently, so violently that it sheared a lightsaber in half. And Rey literally and figuratively closed the Force bond connection with them that Snoke had forged when she closed the ramp of the Millennium Falcon for them to take off and fly away from Crate and escape from the First Order. And this result actually shares something in common with the original trilogy and something in common with the prequel trilogy, but it also adds its own wrinkle as well. So, of course, you will recall that both the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy feature two characters where one character in the relationship grew up under very poor circumstances and the other character grew up under very rich circumstances, and their relationship becomes a very unlikely romance. That would, of course, be Han Solo and Princess Leia at the end of The Empire Strikes Back, and Anakin and Padme at the end of Attack of the Clones. And now, of course, we have Rey and Ben at the end of The Last Jedi. Now, the original trilogy also shares with the sequel trilogy the idea of separating the two at the end of the second movie. Obviously, Han and Leia are already at the I love you, I know point of their relationship before they are separated, but separated they are nonetheless. And the thing that kind of cracked me open on this one is the fact that looking back at the prequel trilogy, we see where Padme is able to fall in love with Anakin, even though Anakin did something pretty horrible in terms of murdering all those Tusken Raiders, although it was because of what happened with his mom, which was pretty awful. And yet, she was still able to see him in a positive light. Is it possible that Rey could see Ben Solo in a positive light despite all the things that he's done? Well, it's certainly possible. And there's actually a fairy tale thing that is out there and could also explain the possibility too, which I will talk about after the break. Stay tuned. This episode is brought to you by Constant Contact, the premier email marketing solution for small businesses and organizations. I've used their service since 2003, and over the past decade and a half, I've watched them evolve, make the product simpler, more powerful, easy to use, and do everything that they can to help train people to use the product more effectively and for it to work with other forms of marketing like social media, for example. So Check out sw7x7.com/email to learn more about Constant Contact and start a free trial. Once again, that is sw7x7.com/email for a free trial. Welcome back. So in storytelling, sometimes there are situations where, straight up enemies can ultimately end up as lovers. And you see a version of this in the original trilogy in some fashion, because certainly Leia and Han are very much at odds with each other when we see them in The Empire Strikes Back, and even in the original Star Wars to a large degree, because she just views him as a mercenary and not somebody who holds the same ideals as she does, that he's only out for himself and can't think of anything larger in life. And yet they are able to find a way to meet in the middle mutually. And something similar could still happen with Rey and Ben Solo. But if they are going to wind up together after all is said and done, the fact of the matter is that he's going to have to come over to the light. She is not going to go over to the dark. That's not how they're going to end the Skywalker saga. So he is going to have to get redeemed at some point. Whether he lives or dies in that redemption is another question entirely. But ultimately, he's going to be the one who has to make the move. And so what is going to be enough of a motivator for him to actually decide to leave the dark side behind and move into the light? That is probably the biggest question that the Rise of Skywalker has to answer, I would say. In fact, when you talk about the Last Jedi situation and how Rian Johnson talked about the problem, if you will, set up for him by J.J. Abrams in having Luke on the island in the middle of nowhere and that nobody had seen him for 10 years. Rian Johnson had to approach the story and say, the big thing I had to do was crack the nut of why Luke was on that island in the first place. And once he had a reason that he could build a story around, that's where he proceeded from. Now we have the same situation, which is how could Ben Solo be redeemed? And this would probably be the biggest nut that J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio have to crack in order to make The Rise of Skywalker work. What is going to be the thing that is worth redeeming himself when he wouldn't do it in The Last Jedi? So there you go. Love to hear what you think the big redeeming thing could be, so drop me a comment wherever you catch this, or if there's no comment section there, at home base for the show at sw7x7.com. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode, and as always, may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
This podcast is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox. It is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other related Star Wars items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2019 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.